Hello everyone, this is Major Grin, and this is a review of the third episode of the Orville. And this episode feels a lot more like Star Trek than the previous episodes. The special effects continue to be great. Every single episode has a whole lot of new special effects in it. That gelatin creature which appeared in the first episode appeared again, so I guess he's a recurring character, which I love, and I loved his scene in this episode. Basically, he was coming on to the doctor, and she rejects him because they are incompatible species, but then he shows her that he can easily grow tentacles, and she gets pissed off and throws him out. And I think this is a very funny scene, and also visually it looks great. That creature really looks great. He looks better than Odo in Deep Space Nine did whenever he was in his liquid form. And this series continues to surprise me with how much good special effects there are and how many new effects are in every single episode. We have a whole bunch of new special effects in space. They have a brief scene of them saving a planet from an asteroid which is about to collide, and they kind of do it casually like it's their everyday life, so I love that little scene. TNG had a whole episode about them saving a planet from an asteroid, and here they do it like in half a minute. So basically they cut the asteroid in half and then push it away with the tractor beam. So I guess for some reason they couldn't just use the tractor beam. They had to first cut it in two for some reason, which is a bit odd, scientifically speaking. And by the way, about the tractor beam, I talked about it in my previous review, and someone mentioned that the tractor beam existed in science fiction literature even before Star Trek. And I agree with that. And by the way, a lot of things that Star Trek showed actually existed in science fiction for many decades before even. So Star Trek was not original in many of the ideas it used. And so technically, if other shows or movies use the same idea, then it's not actually stealing from Star Trek. However, the problem with this show is that they're not just copying the same ideas, they actually copy some of the same visuals. So the tractor beam being blue, for example, is a direct reference to Star Trek. And by the way, I'm not saying that this series shouldn't be doing that. So when I said that CBS might sue them, I'm not in favor of CBS. And in a way, I kind of hope that they will try it so that they will lose in court, and maybe that will actually open the way for many more fan productions of Star Trek kind of movies and shows without being afraid of using the same ideas. So I personally think that people should be free to use the same ideas, even some of the same visuals, and not be restricted just because someone else they used the same ideas before. So I'm totally in favor of free use of such ideas. So there's a lot of new visual stuff every single episode. Also, whenever they show us a planet from space, we can actually see a lot of details on the planet. Whenever they arrive at a planet with an advanced civilization, we can actually see their cities from space, which looks very cool. And this is something we never saw in Star Trek, so once again I say that a lot of the special effects on this show actually look better than in all the previous Star Trek shows. And I also love all the internal sets. However, sometimes we get to see the kind of cheap looking props. For example, whenever we see the captain's chair from behind, you can kind of notice that it's actually a kind of a cheap looking chair. Also in the set of the 10th forward kind of room, the cafeteria room of the ship, the set itself looks really good. However, the tables and chairs look kind of cheap. They kind of look like just regular wooden tables and plastic chairs, as if it's from our time. It doesn't feel futuristic. It doesn't look very impressive at all. So as you see, just wooden tables and plastic chairs, which looks as if they just bought them from some regular store on Earth in the 21st century. So it doesn't really look futuristic at all, so this is a minor complaint I have. Also, once again, they showed the holodeck, which is not called the holodeck here, they call it environmental simulator. And they enjoy an Old West simulation when Bortis comes in, and once again we see that the door is basically like a regular door. And we don't even see the special effects of the door appearing and disappearing, so something is kind of missing whenever they show the simulator. So it doesn't look as good as the holodeck looked in TNG. Also later we have a scene of Alara fighting with Bortis in a simulated boxing ring in the same holodeck, and as you see, the walls are not really that impressive. Kind of simplistic. So this is a minor complaint about the sets. And as for Alara, oh my, she continues to have a lot of good scenes in my opinion. Also, I got used to her look. It was kind of strange in the previous episode when she suddenly looked different than she did in the first episode, because she didn't have eyebrows in the first episode. She looked kind of different. I guess the old makeup was covering up her eyebrows and her nose, and it probably made it more difficult for her to act in that makeup. So maybe it's a good thing they simplified it, so I'm not going to keep whining about that. And as for Bortis, I said in the previous review that he reminds me more of Tilk and not Worf, but in this episode he was much more Worf-like. So he was angry, he was aggressive, he was shouting at people, so he was much more like Worf in this episode. Also, this scene of this guy showing up in his quarters with beer, it really reminded me of a scene in Deep Space Nine in which O'Brien and Bashir kept coming to visit Worf whenever he was grudgy. He always came with a bottle of blood wine, and so this scene really reminded me of that. And this scene also reminded me of Star Trek. Basically, it's the ship's store, I guess. So people come here to replicate things for themselves. Here they don't call it a replicator, they call it a synthesizer. And I love how they show these special effects of things appearing. Instead of a transporter-like effect, it shows us kind of a printer effect, which I guess makes sense because they don't actually have transporters on the ship. So their replicator technology doesn't actually look like a transporter, it looks more like a printer kind of effect, meaning a beam actually goes from bottom to top and kind of creates the object layer by layer instead of all together. And this scene shows kind of a room in which people come to replicate big objects, I guess. And it really reminds me of a scene in TNG in which we saw the same kind of room, in which Worf came to replicate something. And I guess the replicators in the rooms are too small, so whenever you want to replicate something big, then you have to come to this special room. So anyway, Bortis was a lot more like Worf in this episode. Also, we got to see a lot more of his species, of his planet. They show us that their whole planet is industrialized, so they have giant factories everywhere, and it's also stated that they are manufacturing a lot of weapons and testing them out. So they are a very militaristic society and very industrial society. Also, as we learn in this episode, their whole society is only males because basically they artificially removed the females from their society and turned everybody into males because they view females as inferior, both physically and mentally. And because they have such an industrial civilization and apparently a very militaristic society because they always try out weapons, so I guess they viewed females as not really fitting in that society. I guess their females will be able to carry a child without an egg, but since the males can also lay the eggs, then they don't actually need the females. I guess they don't really explain the biological logic in all of this, but I guess that's how it works. So this whole story kind of reminds me of that Star Trek episode, The Outcast, which had a genderless species, and then two of their people basically inseminate the same egg, and then they become the parents, but everybody can mate with anyone, so there are no males and females. So basically they are all a single gender, and each of them is able to procreate and just need someone to inseminate the egg, so they don't actually need to have sex. So this episode really reminded me of that episode of TNG called The Outcast, and also it reminded me of the TNG episode Sins of the Father with the whole trial of Worf, which was very similar to what happened in this episode. So because the child of Bortis was born a female, he says that he wants to change it into a male, but the ship's doctor refuses, and everybody on the Orville tries to talk him out of it, saying that there is nothing wrong about being a female. But he says that in his culture it's considered to be a freak, so if the child will be a female it will be an outcast, and so for the child's sake it's better to simply change his gender to conform to the rest of their species. So this really reminds me of a whole bunch of Star Trek episodes, and especially the episode The Outcast, which had basically a member of that genderless species who feels that she is a female, but that is illegal in their society, and in the end of the episode her people want to take her away by force to undergo treatment to become genderless again. So basically the crew convinces Bortis to let the baby stay female as she was born, but his species wants to force the child to undergo the sex change, and then Bortis has to basically face the trial of his own people. He picks someone from the crew to be his lawyer, just like Worf did, and the scene in the court really reminded me of a whole bunch of other Star Trek episodes too. For example, they present Alara to show that females can also be powerful, and they give her a metal cube so that she can demonstrate how powerful she is, and she turns it into a sphere. And this really reminded me of the episode The Measure of a Man, in which the rights of Data the android were under trial, and Riker gave him a piece of metal to bend. So it really reminded me of this. And by the way, as a science geek, I have a small problem with both of these scenes. If you take a big chunk of metal and you bend it, it will actually get a lot hotter. And in the scene with Data, that can be forgivable because he just made a small bend. But here Alara basically reshaped a cube into a sphere. and they said that it's made out of titanium. So that would mean that that sphere should be very, very hot right now. And yet she throws it at Kelly, who grabs it with no problem. So that bugged me a little bit as a science geek, and it's really a missed opportunity. I would have loved this scene so much more if they actually showed that the ball actually was very hot, and Kelly would have to drop it and so on. So a very big missed opportunity and a lack of science knowledge, and so I have to take a point away from this episode for this scientific inaccuracy. Another problem I had in this trial, in the scene in which Kelly was asking Gordon questions about Earth's history, to demonstrate how clueless he was, even though he's a male. It was a bit funny that he didn't know the capital of the old United States. The problem is that even though it's funny for us as the audience, but it doesn't really make sense, because these aliens wouldn't know the answers either. They wouldn't know if his answers are right or wrong. And so it seemed a bit illogical to use that to try to prove something to these aliens. There were a few funny moments in the trial. My favorite one was when Bortis described his first date with Clyden. He said it was a very fun date because they played combat games in the environmental simulator, and that they shot 300 simulated combatants together. That was pretty funny, mostly because it sounded like a very Klingon way of having fun. I also liked that they brought up the topic of circumcision into the debate, even though it was kind of glossed over, but I do like it that they actually brought it up. That is something that Star Trek probably wouldn't do, since Star Trek was always more kid-friendly compared to this show. Also, it's funny how in the end of the trial they found a woman of that species and brought her to court, and that was also very similar to Sins of the Father, when they actually brought a female witness, even though in that case it had nothing to do with her being a female, but still visually the way they kind of showed that scene was very similar. And it was similar to many old shows about court drama. They always had a witness show up in the very last moment before the trial concluded, and so the same happens here. Just as the trial is about to be finished, suddenly the door opens and someone brings in a new witness. And if this was an actual Star Trek show and not a comedy, then I probably would complain about it for being too glitchy and too cheesy and all of that. But since it's a comedy, it's kind of deliberate. So like a lot of other things in the show, the whole style of it is deliberately like older TV shows. And so that's why I give it a break. And also the ending kind of surprised me, like I didn't expect them to actually do it. I was actually expecting Bortis to take the child and just go on the Orville and basically become an exile from his planet. Maybe I was expecting that because of the Worf connection, because Worf became an exile from his species, so I really expected the same to happen with Bortis. But the episode surprised me by actually having Bortis agree to the procedure, and they actually did transform the baby into a male. And maybe this is a topic that will actually be revisited in future episodes if the series continues, hopefully. And so this was very Star Trek-y type of story. Star Trek often dealt with a lot of controversial topics, and sometimes it was a little bit preachy, sometimes it was a bit one-sided, like showing things in very black and white. But oftentimes when dealing with such topics, they kind of showed all points of view, and they show that people can disagree, and this way the viewer can actually decide what he thinks for himself. So those were the best kinds of episodes in my opinion. And in a few episodes, actually, I think not only were they too preachy, they actually took the wrong side, in my opinion, morality-wise. The best example is probably in the series Enterprise, in which the crew actually decided to basically not give a cure to a dying species because of some stupid reasons. So that was probably the worst example of that, and it's not the only one. In many episodes of Star Trek, and even in some of the movies, they actually took like the wrong side ethically, in my opinion at least. But anyway, I'm not going to review Star Trek in this video, maybe I'll do it separately. This is a video about the Orville, so I did enjoy this episode, and it wasn't perfect, as I said. There were a lot of illogical moments, but still pretty decent, and I think very enjoyable episode. So let me know what you think about it in the comments below, and we can discuss it in the comment section. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe, and make sure to press the notification bell to see future videos. So that's it for now, and I will see you all next time.